In the outlaw motorcycle club world, leaving your club is betrayal, but joining a rival is a death sentence. In a span of 30 years, Frank Lenti did both multiple times. He wore 5 different patches across clubs that considered each other enemies and walked away from each one when he decided he was done. This is the story of the biker who survived a bombing and took on the Hells Angels. Francesco Cisco Lenti was born in 1947 in Woodbridge, Ontario, to Italian immigrant parents. Woodbridge, in the post-war decades, was a community where the lines between the legitimate Italian-Canadian business world and the organized crime networks that ran alongside it were not always clear. Lenti grew up knowing people on both sides of that line. 2 portraits of Lenti exist, and neither one alone tells the full story. The first is the one the journalists wrote. Jerry Langton in 2010 describes a man who, even by Canadian biker standards, was strange prone to violent temper tantrums. A man with a habit of abandoning projects the moment they stopped going his way. Yves Lavigne in 1999 calls him the social butterfly of the biker underworld, who over 20 years wore the colors of nearly half a dozen Toronto gangs and moved on from each one when he did not get his way. That reputation produced the nickname that followed him everywhere in the Ontario biker world. The Velcro biker. The second portrait is the one the biker world knew. Peter Edwards, the crime correspondent for the Toronto Star, wrote that no one could count on coming out on top in a fight with Lenti, and that guys who went toe-to-toe with the veteran bikers sometimes came away with one less functioning eye. He had a documented habit of gouging out the eyes of his enemies in fights, and his reputation for doing so was specific enough and consistent enough that it preceded him into every room he walked into. Those who knew him inside the Bandidos described him as measured consistent and one of the toughest 1%ers in Canada. A man with convictions for extortion and armed robbery on his record, and a limp from a 1995 pipe bomb attack that he carried for the rest of his life. The man the newspapers described could not hold a patch. The man the biker world knew could not be touched by anyone who wanted to take one from him. Both portraits are accurate, and understanding how one man contains both of them is where this story begins. Satan's choice and the ambition that had no ceiling. Lenti entered the outlaw biker world in the early 1970s through Satan's Choice Motorcycle Club. At that point, Satan's Choice was the most powerful outlaw motorcycle club in Ontario, with a strict hierarchy, a reputation for violence, and a membership that included some of the most dangerous men in the province. The Hells Angels had not yet made their move into Ontario. Satan's Choice owned the territory, and everyone inside the Ontario biker world understood that. Lenti was ambitious from the beginning, but ambition in the 1%er world is only useful if the organization you are inside has room for you to rise, and Satan's Choice did not give him that room. Despite years of involvement, Lenti never rose above the rank of prospect. It was a ceiling he could not break through regardless of how long he stayed or what he was willing to do. During his time with Satan's Choice, Lenti associated closely with a fellow member named Cecil Kirby. Kirby was not a conventional biker. Alongside his Satan's Choice membership, he worked as an enforcer and contract hitman for York Region Mafia figures, making him one of the more dangerous men inside an already dangerous organization. Lenti and Kirby spent considerable time together, and that association would eventually force Lenti out of the country entirely. If Satan's Choice had given Lenti a path upward, he might have stayed, and the clubs he built and destroyed and rebuilt over the following decades might never have existed. But the organization he had committed years to would not promote him past prospect, and therefore in 1978, he left. He joined the Rebels Motorcycle Club in Toronto alongside a fellow Italian-Canadian biker named Gennaro Rasso. The Rebels' stint lasted roughly a year. Lenti was already thinking about building something that answered to him rather than limiting him, and Rasso was thinking the same thing. The conversation about what came next did not take long. Building the Loners. In 1979, Lenti and Gennaro Rasso co-founded the Loners Motorcycle Club in Woodbridge, Ontario. The name was chosen deliberately. In a biker world that celebrated belonging to something larger than yourself, Two men who had spent years being told they did not belong decided to make the condition of not belonging the identity of their club. They were the Loners, and they intended to make that name mean something. Lenti designed the club patch himself, a rather elaborate and bizarre half-werewolf, half-horned skull creature that became one of the most distinctive patches in Canadian biker culture. The design was his, and it reflected something specific about how he saw the club. Not a copy of anything that already existed. The Loners drew mainly from the Italian-Canadian community in and around Woodbridge. A disproportionate number of the early members came from middle-class families who saw themselves as more polished and sophisticated than the men who populated most Ontario outlaw clubs. Other clubs predictably mocked them as the losers. The mockery did not slow the expansion. Jerry Langton documents that during this period, Lenti was personally successful in two businesses that the biker world tended to respect: a stripper and escort talent agency and a tow truck firm. The tow truck business in particular gave him legitimate cover and a network of contacts across the Toronto area that proved useful in ways that extended well beyond roadside assistance. But the club that Lenti had built from nothing collapsed under him before it had been running 5 years. In 1981, Lenti was expelled from his own club. Lenti attributes his departure entirely to the fact that his associate Cecil Kirby turned police informer, and that leaving was a matter of survival rather than internal club politics. Jerry Langton states plainly that Lenti had been expelled for stealing from club funds and had left for Italy until tempers cooled. Lenti has never acknowledged the theft allegations and has maintained his version of events consistently across multiple interviews over several decades. What is not disputed is what he did next. Rather than stay in Canada and face whatever was waiting for him, Lenti fled to Italy. He settled in Perugia and associated with the Italian Hells Angels during his time there. And in a move that said everything about how he operated, he continued using the Loners' name despite having been expelled from the club that bore it. While living as a fugitive from his own organization in a country where nobody had jurisdiction over him, he opened new Loners chapters across Italy, including chapters in Naples, Messina Salerno, Reggio Calabria, Barolo, Avellino, and Isernia. He was building the club's international presence from exile, while the men who had expelled him were running the Canadian operation without him. In 1984, with Gennaro Rosso's blessing, Lenti officially rejoined the Loners and returned to Canada. He refounded the club in New York region, recruiting again from the Italian-Canadian community, and rebuilt what had collapsed during his absence. By the late 1980s, the Loners were the third largest motorcycle club in Ontario, exceeded only by the Outlaws and Satan's Choice. By the start of the 1990s, the club had chapters in Toronto, Woodbridge, Richmond Hill, Windsor, and London in Canada, and maintained its Italian chapters in Portugal and 7 locations across Italy. The club that other gangs had called the Losers had become one of the most significant outlaw organizations in the country. The Hells Angels offer the Second Expulsion and the Diablos. On June 16, 1993, Lenti was approached at a bikers convention in Wasaga Beach by Walter the Nurget Stadnik, the national president of the Canadian Hells Angels. Stadnik had a specific proposal. He wanted the Loners to patch over to the Hells Angels, giving the Angels an established Ontario club with existing chapters, membership, and territory, rather than having to build their Ontario presence from scratch. Stadnik had already made the same offer to Bernie Gwindon of Satan's Choice and been turned down. Now he was making it to Lenti. Joining Stadnik at the meeting was David Wolf Carroll, who wore a t-shirt with SS runes reading Filthy Few Denmark. In Hells Angels culture, the Filthy Few designation is worn by members who have killed for the club. Lenti understood Carroll's choice of clothing as a deliberate message about what he was capable of, and by extension, what the Angels were capable of if the conversation did not go the way they wanted. Lenti turned down the offer. In 1994, the Loners expelled him for the second time. Langton attributes it to theft from club funds. Levine attributes it to one too many temper tantrums from a man whose colleagues had grown tired of managing his volatility. Rather than accepting the expulsion and disappear from the Ontario biker world, Lenti immediately founded a new club called the Diablos motorcycle gang in the same territory the loners controlled. The message was straightforward. If the loners would not have him, he would build a rival directly underneath them and fight for the same ground. The Diablos entered a biker war with the loners almost immediately. Through 1995, the conflict produced bombings and shootings across the Toronto area that drew sustained law enforcement attention to both organizations. On August 1, 1995, the front door of the Satan's Choice Toronto clubhouse on Kintyre Avenue was destroyed by an explosion attributed to a handheld rocket launcher in the ongoing hostilities between the various factions that had been drawn into the conflict. Then, on August 25, 1995, a remote-controlled car bomb exploded outside Lenti's Woodbridge residence. Lenti survived, but the blast cost him one of his buttocks and left him with a limp that he carried for the rest of his life. Toronto bikers gave him a nickname that reflected the injury with the particular cruelty that the biker world reserves for men it cannot kill. The half-assed biker. When police arrived at the scene following the explosion, they found a handgun and a loaded machine gun in his car, and Lenti faced weapons charges on top of everything else. Without Lenti's operational leadership, the Diablos collapsed by late 1995 while he was recovering in hospital. The biker war ended in a stalemate, with neither side having gained enough ground to justify the casualties and the legal exposure the conflict had produced. Lenti was left without a club for the first time since the early 1970s. The organization he had built twice and been expelled from twice was still standing. The organization he had built to replace it was gone, and the man who had survived a car bomb in his own driveway was recovering in a hospital bed trying to work out what came next. The Bandidos and the Living Legend. In 2001, a significant portion of the Canadian Loners membership made a collective decision to patch over to the Bandidos Motorcycle Club, which was pushing into Ontario as a counterweight to the Hells Angels' dominance that had been building in the province since 2000. Lenti went with them. He joined the Bandidos Toronto chapter, and for the first time in his career found himself inside an organization with genuine international backing and a mother chapter in Houston that gave the Canadian operation a legitimacy it had never had as an independent club. He was brought in specifically to invigorate the Toronto chapter and make it more attractive to smaller clubs across Ontario that were considering their options as the Hells Angels consolidated their position. His reputation was supposed to do the work. A living legend within Canadian outlaw biker circles with close links to organized crime, and a career that had produced two clubs, a car bombing, and a biker war was exactly the kind of figure the Toronto Bandidos needed to be taken seriously. What Lenti found when he arrived was not what he had been led to expect. Many of the Toronto chapter members did not own working motorcycles. In a culture built entirely on the motorcycle as the foundation of identity and brotherhood, the most basic requirement of membership was not being met by the men who were supposed to represent the club. Lenti's response to this was immediate and direct. He called them bikers without bikes. It was not a term of affection. His contempt for the chapter's standards extended to its leadership. Toronto chapter president Frank the Bammer Salerno was a heroin addict at a time when Lenti refused to even smoke cigarettes on the grounds that using drugs was for weak men. When Salerno gave himself a Bastogne tattoo that Lenti considered his own personal mark. Lenti beat him and told him to have it covered up. When Lenti later found insulting comments about himself on the Bandidos website and traced the IP address to an area where Salerno lived, he confronted the chapter president directly. Salerno broke down in tears and begged Lenti, please, not to get eyes as punishment. The man who led the Toronto Bandidos was begging the man who had just joined not to blind him over a website comment. But the most significant thing Lenti did during his time with the Bandidos had nothing to do with Salerno. Shortly after joining, he identified Michael Taz Sandom as a serious problem. Sandom was the leader of the Winnipeg chapter that had been admitted to the Bandidos on probationary status, and his demeanor struck Lenti immediately as wrong. Sandom had completely bare arms with no tattoos, which was highly unusual for any biker, let alone a one-percenter who had supposedly been in the life long enough to hold a leadership position. His manner, according to Lenti, was like that of a policeman doing a very clumsy impression of an outlaw biker. Lenti kept hearing rumors that Sandom had previously been a policeman and had been rejected by the outlaws for that reason. He also noted that Sandom seemed like the sort of man who would have sucked up to the high school bully rather than stand up for himself. Lenti took his concerns directly to Sergeant at Arms Wayne Kellerstein and asked him to investigate. He followed up. Kellerstein dismissed the concerns, casually saying the rumors were not true and Sandom had never been a policeman. Lenti was furious at the response. The amateurism of a club leadership that could not be bothered to properly investigate a credible concern about a chapter president was the same amateurism he had seen in the members who did not own motorcycles. It was the same organization with different faces. In November 2004, Lenti quit. He told anyone who asked that Musadere was addicted to cocaine, Kellerstein was insane, and he was tired of dealing with both of them. When he walked in to hand over his Bandido patch, the contrast with what happened to other members who tried to leave was immediate and visible. Glenn Wrongway Atkinson, who had also decided to leave, was beaten bloody by Musadere and Kellerstein before being allowed to go. Lenti handed in his patch and walked out untouched. The men who had beaten Atkinson without hesitation did not lay a hand on Lenti. His reputation for what he did to people's eyes in a fight was the only protection he needed, and it was enough. Kellerstein later sent an email to other Bandidos chapters claiming Lenti had been expelled in an attempt to save face. Lenti had not been expelled. He had decided he was done and left. The distinction mattered to him, and he made sure the record reflected it. The dramatic irony of what followed his departure is one of the most significant details in the entire Ontario biker history of that period. Lenti had correctly identified Michael Sandom as a former policeman. He had raised the alarm through the proper internal channels. He had been dismissed and had quit in disgust. On April 8, 2006, 8 Bandidos members and associates were found shot dead in 4 vehicles in a farmer's field outside Shedden, Ontario. Sandom was one of the men convicted of their murders. If the leadership Lenti had tried to warn had listened to him, the 8 men who drove to Wayne Kellerstein's farm that night might have lived. The assassination plot that was never real. After leaving the Bandidos in November 2004, Lenti did not step back from the Ontario biker world. He watched the Shedden massacre destroy the Canadian Bandidos in April 2006, and then did something that nobody who knew the political landscape of Ontario organized crime could have described as anything other than provocative. He rejoined the Bandidos on May 24, 2006, and began pushing aside both Sandom and his rivals to position himself as the man who would rebuild the organization from the wreckage the massacre had left behind. The Hells Angels had spent years consolidating their dominance over Ontario. The prospect of Frank Lenti rebuilding the one organization capable of challenging them was not something they were prepared to allow. Hells Angels Oshawa Chapter President Mark Stevenson and former Oshawa Angel turned nomad Ramondre Ackley approached a man named Stephen Galt with a contract to kill Lenti. The motivation was documented and specific. They believed Lenti was about to revive the moribund Bandidos in Canada and challenge the Hells Angels for turf in Ontario. The killing was described internally as being to benefit the club. Galt was chosen as the man who would carry it out. What Stevenson and Ackley did not know was that Galt was secretly a police informer, a career criminal who specialized in cheating seniors out of their life savings and who had once bitten off the ear of a man in a bar fight. Galt was not the kind of man whose reliability anyone with good judgment would have staked their future on, but Stevenson and Ackley staked theirs on him anyway. On September 28, 2006, both men were charged with ordering Galt to kill Lenti. Police informed Lenti of the plot. In keeping with the outlaw biker code, he refused the offer of police protection. He began carrying a handgun instead, and continued stating publicly that he intended to rebuild the Bandidos in Canada, regardless of what the Hells Angels thought about it. But the plot that Lenti had been arming himself against was not what it appeared to be. On November 7, 2008, the Crown's case against Ackley and Stevenson collapsed when Ackley revealed to the court that he himself had been a police informer since 2002 and that there had never been a genuine murder plot against Lenti. Peter Edwards concluded in his reporting that Galt had manufactured the entire alleged conspiracy in order to collect a $1 million payment from the Crown for delivering a case against two Hells Angels. The professional con man had run his longest con against the justice system itself. On January 18, 2009, Ackley and Stevenson were acquitted. The jury ruled that the Crown's case rested entirely on the unreliable word of Stephen Galt, and that without his testimony, there was nothing. Two Hells Angels chapter presidents had been charged with conspiracy to murder and walked out of court free men because the informant who had sold them out had invented the crime he was reporting. The consequence that Edwards documents is the one that matters most to the Lenti story. Because Lenti had been told by police that there was a genuine contract on his life. He had spent the months between September 2006 and December 2006 believing that the Hells Angels were actively trying to kill him. As a result of Galt's lies, Lenti had killed Buchanan believing he was out to kill him, when in reality Buchanan was seeking to intimidate him. The assassination plot that never existed produced a killing that did. The night at Club Pro. Shortly after midnight on December 2, 2006, four Hells Angels arrived at the Club Pro adult entertainment strip club and bar in Vaughan. Frank Lenti was working there that night as a security manager. The owner of Club Pro, Dominic Mimo Marciano, had hired Lenti specifically for his presence and his reputation, describing his role in plain terms. He was kind of the buffer, the cooler, to eliminate the other element that we didn't want. The four Angels were led by David White Dread Buchanan, the sergeant at arms of the Hells Angels West Toronto chapter. Buchanan was 33 years old that night and had gone out drinking to celebrate his birthday. Law enforcement knew him as one of Toronto's principal gun runners, who sold weapons the Angels had smuggled in from the United States to street gangs across the city. The office of Sergeant at Arms in outlaw motorcycle club culture is generally held by the toughest member in a chapter, and Buchanan had been appointed to that position specifically because of his brutality, strength, and cruelty. In his drunken state, Buchanan began threatening Lenti. The other three Angels positioned themselves around Lenti, cutting off any route of exit. Lenti understood immediately what the situation was. He was a 59-year-old man with a limp from a car bombing, walking with a cane in a room with four Hells Angels surrounding him, and a belief established by police 6 weeks earlier that the Angels had put a contract on his life. Lenti moved toward the lobby where the lighting was better, and a security camera was recording everything. The footage that camera captured became the central piece of evidence in everything that followed. It showed Lenti calmly and repeatedly asking the Angels to please go home while Buchanan escalated. Then Buchanan began striking Lenti with the other three Angels still surrounding him. Lenti drew a gun and shot Buchanan. Buchanan died from the wound. A second Angels member was shot and wounded. The other two fled. The detail that distinguishes the Club Pro shooting from the dozens of similar confrontations that had taken place in the Ontario biker world over the preceding decades is what Lenti had done before any of it started. He had moved to the lobby because he knew the camera was there. In a world where disputes between clubs were settled in back rooms and parking lots away from any recording, Lenti had positioned himself in front of a lens and made sure that whatever happened next was documented. The video footage showed clearly that Buchanan was the aggressor that Lenti had repeatedly attempted to de-escalate, and that Buchanan had thrown the first punch while three other Angels blocked every exit. That footage was what caused the Crown to abandon the second-degree murder charge and negotiate a plea. In the days following the shooting, several Hells Angels contacted Lenti's family and told them that Buchanan had been out of line and that the killing was justified given that Lenti had only fired after being struck. The Hells Angels National Secretary was reported to have said that up until the shooting he had maintained a good relationship with Lenti and that Lenti had once saved his life. The organization whose sergeant at arms had just been killed was telling the man who killed him that he had been right to do it. Lenti turned himself into police the following day. He appeared composed during his brief video court appearance in Newmarket, Ontario. He had a noticeable black eye that his lawyer attributed to the confrontation at Club Pro. The charge was second-degree murder. On April 14, 2008, Frank Lenti stood before Justice Michael Brown in a Woodbridge courtroom and pleaded guilty to manslaughter in the death of David Buchanan and to aggravated assault for the wounding of the Second Angels member present that night at Club Pro. The murder charge that he had faced since December 2006 was gone. The security camera footage from the Club Pro lobby had done exactly what Lenti had positioned himself in front of it to do. It showed Buchanan as the aggressor. It showed Lenti repeatedly attempting to calm the situation. It showed 3 angels surrounding him with no exit available. Justice Brown ruled that since Buchanan had struck Lenti multiple times before Lenti fired, Lenti had a legitimate fear for his life. The Crown accepted the manslaughter plea rather than risk a jury seeing that footage and returning a not guilty verdict on self-defense grounds entirely. Lenti received a 6-year sentence. The response from within the Hells Angels to the outcome was as extraordinary as anything the Ontario biker world had produced in years. Several angels had already told Lenti's family in the days after the shooting that Buchanan had been out of line. The National Secretary had acknowledged that Lenti had once saved his life. Now, the organization whose sergeant-at-arms had been killed on his birthday was watching the man who killed him walk away with 6 years on a manslaughter plea and offering no meaningful retaliation. The Angels' National Secretary's public acknowledgement that Lenti had once saved his life had drawn a line that the organization was not willing to cross, even in the aftermath of losing one of its most senior members. But the most revealing detail from the period between his arrest and his sentencing did not come from the courtroom. It came from the Catholic school his son Jesse attended in Woodbridge. While Lenti was in custody awaiting trial, the school principal reached out to him about his son's behavior. Lenti's response was to give the principal permission to strike his son if he misbehaved. He told Jesse directly during that period, "I had a lot of fun, but in the end, you end up in a place like this." I always told him that I didn't want him involved in my business. The man who had spent 3 decades moving through the most violent criminal motorcycle club world in Canadian history had drawn one line that he was not willing to let his son cross, and his son had not crossed it. The legacy, what the Velcro biker actually was over 3 decades. Frank Lenti wore the colors of 5 Ontario motorcycle clubs: Satan's Choice, the Rebels, the Loners, which he founded, the Diablos, which he also founded, the Bandidos. He was expelled from his own club twice. He also saw things clearly that others chose not to see. He identified Michael Sandom as a former policeman before the Shedden massacre. He raised the alarm through the proper internal channels. He was dismissed and quit in disgust. The Velcro biker, whose judgment the organization did not trust, had been right. The men who dismissed him were either dead or in prison for murder when the trial ended in 2009. His son Jesse has no criminal record. He applied to the Canadian Army and was rejected. He is trying to go in a straight line. The man who built 2 clubs survived a car bombing shot a Hells Angels sergeant-at-arms and spent 3 decades as one of the most feared figures in the Ontario biker world, told his son from a prison cell that he did not want him involved in his business. That instruction was the one that stuck: the Velcro biker. The patches kept coming off, but every organization he left was still thinking about him long after he was gone. Lenti spent 30 years being right about things that nobody listened to and walking away from organizations that could not hold him. The 1%er world that produced him traces its entire identity back to a single drunken weekend in California in 1947 and a club that never wanted the reputation it accidentally created. Click the next video to find out where it all started.